No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I just hope that you all are not going to hear my heartbeat as it's throbbing right now. I'm actually going to be doing 3 sessions. The module was kind of changed because initially I thought we were going to be 10 people in the room, and with 80 people, things don't quite work the same way. So my first session is going to be, the 2 first sessions sort of lead into a mapping session I'm going to be doing on Saturday that I'm trying to recruit everyone in the room to come and scribble on a piece of paper. But how I'm going to start today is with the first session about how I got to the reflection that I want to share with you, which is mostly about the division on the continent between the north of the continent and the south, and how these divisions came about, why they're there, and why we as Africans adhere to them. So, but I'm going to start this, I'm going to try and make this as personal as possible. So I'm going to start my talk with how I got to being a Pan-Africanist, and I'll try and define, although I don't like defining these things. For me, Pan-Africanist means that I believe that us on the continent have a common history and had a common vision at independence of where it is we wanted to go and how we could collaborate together and have some kind of a solidarity to get to where we wanted in the post-colonial period. So that's where I stop. I actually would like to start this session by quoting from Olo Ogibe, who's an amazing Nigerian. He did an essay called Exile and the Creative Imagination. And for me, I wanted to start, actually, when the others started, everyone was saying, I'm Ugandan, I'm Mozambican, but I lived here, I'm here. So we've all somehow lived exile. And today on the continent, a lot of people are going into exile. So where do we stand as Africans, even if the space we're in is not the space of belonging, and what does the space of belonging actually mean? So I'll start with the quote that says, the sojourn of exile is particularly tragic because it is inevitably and inescapably bracketed by the fact of loss, not of things willingly forsaken, but of things forcibly left behind. Things from which separation is a violent act that leaves a wound for which there is no healing, even to the grave. He goes on to say that exile demands contemplation because it is unavoidably real for those who experience it. More than a word, exile is also a condition. It is a place, a knowledge, a narrative, but most importantly, it is a psychic space that is obvious to those who inhabit it, those who must engage and wrestle with it, because only by doing so can they come to terms with it. So identity and belief, or the lack of them actually, pave one's future engagement with the space we choose to inhabit. Today, more than ever, Africans are crossing the seas and generations are growing up in Europe. Yet transmission of our specific cultural heritage doesn't cease. How was my Egyptian identity forged and my Pan-African beliefs consolidated despite living in the diaspora my entire life? I want to share the influences and the spaces that got me to this belonging. I'm going to start actually with showing you the installation I had in this year's Biennale in Dakar. If I figure out how to do this, there we go. There you go. There we go. So I put up this map and the influences that were both sound, visual, and space. How do we get the transmission of knowledge that we don't even know we have. I mean, I spent my whole life thinking I was a citizen of the world until, you know, I was confronted by the fact that in Europe, I'm a foreigner. When I go back home, I'm treated as a foreigner. And everywhere you go, you sort of need to identify where this belonging is. Let me try and just get to the next bit. Okay. I'm quite challenged. Cursor, can anyone see a cursor? There you go. Help, help. No, it's not. Okay. Help me. Okay, but can we just make it small? Okay, this is the next one. Okay, so I put up actually threads of everywhere I have personally lived. So I'm Egyptian, but I was born in Lebanon, and I grew up between Panama, Finland, East Germany, anywhere you can imagine. I've lived in 32 countries. And when I say lived, it's like beyond 6 months. And actually, so I've lived in the Congo, I've lived in Havana, I've lived here in Joburg, I've lived everywhere. So how is it that we sort of move on and try and forge an identity? Okay, here we go. Okay. My father represented Egypt, so we grew up saying we are Egyptian. But what does the word Egyptian actually mean? From where I was sitting, Egyptian was contained in the next thing I'm going to show you, which I hope I will be able. There you go. Let's try and make it big and then call for help later. Okay. Okay, play, spacebar. There you go. This goes on forever. Obviously, it's a very militarized tone, which is quite important in the post-independence period. But I wanted to show this because the content, whoever speaks Arabic here, is all about unity, colonialism, working together, the idea of a nation. And I intercut with it some of the images that I grew up with, which is the African side of the concept of the Egyptian, the manifesto of the Egyptian revolution basically was based on two concentric circles. We have Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism, and together they have to survive to be able and help each other to make it possible for the continent to go further. And my father worked with a guy called Mohammed Faye, who was Nasser's envoy to supporting all the African revolutions. And so I grew up meeting Lumumba's kids coming to Cairo and living in Egypt, Nkrumah's kids living Gamal, who had also an Egyptian mother. So the idea of being an African was basically what I thought I had grew up with, okay? And obviously, I need to get this out of, bye-bye. So basically, with all of this and traveling from place to place, you eventually go to the best schools and grow up to have a common identity with all these different people and think of yourself as a global citizen. And for me, my first shock happened with the first Gulf War in 1990, when I was, at the time, I was a journalist working for the Washington Post, and I was covering the Gulf War, and the Egyptian army was the second largest contingent on the ground. So I couldn't quite understand how and why the Egyptian army would be involved in destroying and completely wiping out our brothers of Iraq. So So obviously this whole notion of Pan-Arabism was put in question, and my own identity, like as writing for an American paper, what am I supposed to be doing? How am I supposed to be feeling? How can I actually cover something not knowing where my own distance from it is? So after that war, I got terribly, terribly depressed and sat at home for almost a year just reading. And until I came across a book by a Senegalese writer, physicist, an amazing guy that I hope you all, if you don't know him, then go discover him. It's called Cheikh Anta Diop. Who knows Cheikh Anta Diop? Okay, great. At least some of you do. Cheikh Anta Diop was actually a physicist. He discovered carbon-14, which is carbon dating. So when we sort of knowing how old the pyramids is, so he was like this big physicist who suddenly decided that, you know what, all this, I'm putting this aside, and he became an Egyptologist, because from his point of view, a big problem on the continent was the way we have excluded Egypt from the notion of Africanness. And he goes on to prove the extent to which Egypt is black and has always been black, but that the colonial project itself, before starting colonialism, its first mission was to exclude Egypt from the idea of Africa, because colonialism is based on the idea of civilizing the barbarians. So if you keep Egypt inside Africa, then you can't really civilize the barbarians because their civilization is up there on the wall. And so he did he actually wrote a PhD, which the Sorbonne refused to discuss for several years, and he printed it in a book called Nation Nègre et Culture. And so for me, that was a real revelation, trying to follow what Cheikh Anta Diop was saying and figuring out for myself how the complete dissociation between who we have become as Egyptians and where we originally came for. And for me, the biggest question is like, why are we not even questioning this? Why is this not on the table? We, as a nation, we have 10% of Nubians who are blacker than any black person on the continent, yet we have become we have a certain kind of mépris, disdain, and look down on the continent as though it's below us. Where did that come from? And why do we perpetuate it? So would you like to hear, actually no, you are gonna hear, in French. Cheikh Anta Diop himself took me, I did a lot of research to find that bit of sound, so you are gonna hear it. Okay, so basically I got into Cheikh Anta Diop and started reading his stuff, and I decided to completely shift the way I do things, and I started making my films, mainly in Africa, and I went for the first time to the most important African film festival called FESPACO. And that year in 1995, it was African filmmakers had come together to start a, talk with a common voice, and they started something called the Guild of African Filmmakers in the Diaspora. Of course, I was really, really excited, we're all brothers and everything. And I remember in that meeting, we were having this discussion, and at some point I put up my hand to say something, and one of my fellow filmmakers, he says, "No, you can't talk." And I'm like, "Why?" He says, "No, you're not African." I said, "No, I'm Egyptian." And he says, "No, Egypt is in Africa." And oh my God, I just come out of this massive Cheikh Anta Diop, the whole vision. And I had a massive fight. It's like, how dare you tell me if I'm African or not? He says, well, you have to choose. Are you Arab or are you African? And that question of choosing, am I Arab or am I African, lasted a long time, because until today, people say, no, but you're Arab. It's as though somehow, being Arab, you can't be African. And I always sort of try and sort of show that the Pearl, for example, the Pearl are direct descendants of Egypt, and they occupy 6 countries, they share a language. So why is it that in our heads we can accept Pearl, Zulu, all different ethnic groups as being African, yet in our heads, somehow if you're an Arab, you're out? And that's something I'm gonna try and remap later. And then what does Arab actually mean? How far down do you go? Is Chad Arab? Is Senegal Arab? Because, I mean, all these, I think it's what I'd like to question in the coming 2 sessions, is all these givens that we take without questioning. And so basically, from there where I wanted to go is to show that on the continent, this division between North and South did not exist at the beginning. At the beginning, when I say the beginning, I'm starting from just the pre-independence, the beginning of the struggle period. Let's say by you know, the end of the World War, when it was obvious that the next phase is going to be a different phase. And so the interconnections on the continent were massive. So when Nelson Mandela wanted, before he was arrested, wanted to get training to start the armed wing of the ANC, he went to train in Algeria. When, so for example, there was an import-export company called the Nasser Trading Company, that it was an Egyptian trading company based in the Ivory Coast. Its main mission was to give arms to the independence movements in the south. So Angola got all its arms from the Nasser company. So if you actually sit down and try to map out the interconnections, I mean, of course, Libya, because when Nasser, just before Nasser's death in 1970, Gaddafi did a coup d'etat, and he was like, his mentor was Nasser. And the Gaddafi that became what some people called the African king, it was just his vision to continue the work that Nasser had started. So why is it that we sort of skip that bit, skip the attempt to collaborate between the north and the south of the continent, and find it easier to collaborate with the north-north rather than collaborate with the north of the continent? So the interconnections were many. So when Nkrumah, another thing, we always date African independence to 1957 with Ghana. But the real, I mean, 1952 in Egypt was the beginning of independence, but we can't say 52 because we didn't kick out the 80,000 British soldiers until 1956. So it's just a year before Ghana, yet it's completely overlooked. So, but 1956 is a very important year, and I want you to retain it for tomorrow's session, because it's going to come up. What happened in 1956 was the nationalization of the Suez Canal. It seems like just a banal sort of moment of a country taking over its own resources, but it was actually a very dramatic year, because in 1956, it was obvious that it was end of empire. the new world order was being forged. So at the Suez Crisis, for example, new things that we live with until today happened. Like, for example, the setting up of peacekeeping forces of the United Nations happened because of Suez. And it's part of that world order that we live with. When there's a problem in Africa, we go get the UN rather than doing the inter-African things that happened right before 1956. So lots of things happened at the time. And for example, until between 1952 and 1974, Egypt had something called Cairo Radio that had 18 different Bantu languages broadcasting 24 hours a day. And we had a transistor factory, you know, the tiny little transistors that were distributing transistors all over the continent. So communications, physical support, material support, and mostly intellectual support. So I want to show you a set of pictures, if I can manage that. So let's start here, okay? I'm not going to make it big so I don't... these are a set of meetings that happened in 1961 when the African leaders were all sitting together trying to think up how to set up an organization that eventually became the OAU. So a whole series of partnerships and cooperation agreements were set up, and there was this 1 week in Addis where, so you're going to see Nasser. I mean, obviously I have Nasser everywhere because my research was on Nasser, so that's how I got the pictures. But they're amazing pictures. So you get a whole, let me just flip through them. Shall I make them bigger, or is that okay? Okay. So that's Nyerere and Modibo Keita with Nasser. And that's the actual day of the inauguration of the OAU in 1963. They're not in order. They were, but they're not anymore. Okay, so these are the sets of agreements that were being signed prior. Yeah. So anyway, so I mean, I have thousands and thousands of pictures that I've been collecting for more than 20 years. But if you see the level of not just the fact that they were signing agreements together way before the creation of the OAU, but there was a real interaction. Like, you have all these pictures with the leaders with their families, and you know, they knew each other socially. They interacted with each other socially to try and create a common vision. Now, arts and culture, of course, were a very important aspect of this. I know one of you was talking about, I think Fola it was, who was talking about Festman, Festac, and all of that. They were really, first of all, Festac, Festman, and the Pan-Af were financed by the cultural departments of the newly independent states. And what I find interesting is like the big discussion, where does the crack start? I think one of the really interesting things to think about is that crack in the North-South debate obviously happens around the color politics. And the whole idea of Pan-Africanism versus negritude is a discussion that starts in 1956 in Paris. And Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and mainly the island, a lot of the island thinkers, so even on the Pan-African side, Trinidadians like C.L.R. James, Padmore, and all these people started thinking of the word African to mean black. And in 1966, when Festman was being put together, they decided that no, the north of the continent cannot be invited to the African cultural event because they're not black. And funny enough, it was the Nigerians who stood up to the Senegalese and said, what do you mean they're not black? Because, yeah, they might have gone through some kind of a color transformation, but the history, the color, the history, you know, everything and the collaborations we've been through, they can't be excluded. And so it was a big fight that I think at the end there was like minor representation, but that was followed by 1969, the Pan-Af in Algeria, which was one of the biggest manifestations where absolutely everyone was invited. Unfortunately, I didn't have a clip with me, but you have collaborations between Miriam Makeba and, you know, it was literally all over the continent, and it was this sense of a solidarity through arts and culture. And of course, now the Festac in Lagos, it was initially supposed to be for 1972, and it was called the Second World Black Cultural Festival. And again, there was a whole discussion over that, and it ended up being called the Second World Black and African Cultural Festival. So the problematic around how is it do we see ourselves? Can we see ourselves as African only through the grid of color? And if it is through the grid of color, where's the shade you stop it at? Like, I mean, our Sutus, who are slightly clearer, do they become not African? Or are they, you know, where does the shade stop? And what is it? What is it? What does the word African mean? And when, for me, that's the biggest question that we're going to address tomorrow. When is it that the Sahara became a space of division and of nothingness, when traditionally, since the 13th century, it was the space of exchange, of cultural cohesion, of commerce. It was the space where everything linked the north and the south. And today we think of the Sahara as though it's like this piece of sand that above it is something and below it is something else. And like the Arabs live up there and the real Africans live down there. I think for me, one of the, sorry. So for me, one of the things that I would really like you to reflect on is this moment, and why is it that there is such, I can't find a word for mépris. Can anyone help me with mépris? No? Despise? Maybe disdain? Yeah. Where did it come from? Because, so certainly until 1974, there was a lot of collaboration. And the 6th Pan-African Congress that is sort of the lineage of the Pan-African Congresses that started in the 1900s with, you know, the fathers of what we call the fathers of Pan-Africanism, like W.E.B. Du Bois and, you know, the Padmores and the C.L.R. James and all of that. The last Congress, which is the 6th Pan-African Congress, call it the six-pack, not the beer, but was the first and only one to be done on the African continent. And it's at this point in Tanzania, it happened in 1974 in Tanzania, and I think it's at this point that there was this sudden realization that there is a clash between what we think Pan-Africanism is and what the reality of what Pan-Africanism can be from an internal space of collaboration. And, you know, many of you might jump at me to when I say what I'm going to say right now, but the Pan-African space that came from the Americas is a space where slavery is the backbone of reflection. And slavery for the transatlantic is a history of pain, of violence, of oppression, and of indignity. Whereas if you take it from the African continent, the same event was a space of mourning, a space of loss, a space of absence, and it's a very different space. So, I mean, I have had occasions where I'd sit around the table and speak to a very knowledgeable Black American about Fanon, and he'd be saying things and says, no, 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 that's not what he's saying. And we look at the same sentence and we understand it from a different space. And I think it's that different space that I'm urging you to come in with me and try and figure out where these divisions happened. Voila. Thank you. So this piece I made a few years ago called Flag Moments. And what I really wanted to do was to just look at this moment of raising the flag, the moment where the idea is that we have become independent. To look at, first of all the visual aspect of all the different countries getting independence is always the same. You have the army, you have the crowds cheering. So there's a kind of a richness and a diversity to a same story being replayed. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that I divided this thing into three. The first section is the first independences of the 60s, which you could always see everybody was happy and dancing, and there was a lot of fireworks, and our leaders would take the piece of paper, thank the colonial power, and leave, and we're all very happy. There was a second phase, which is the phase of, which is the 70s, which is the phase of armed struggle. And the phase of armed struggle, it's a very sort of Cold War imagery of socialism, and the gun and the tools and the work is going to triumph. And the third, being the last phase, is one of negotiation. We sit around the table and we figure out how we co-opt that word, independence. But if you actually look at it, I guess my point is, look, and that's a question for everyone, does anyone really think we got independence? I don't. I think it's a process. I think that we all became tribes with flags, and flags are really important, but then how do we give that content? And to come back to my original theme, and how do we maintain that vision of the commonality and how to move forward? And so, to come back to the displacement, okay, cursor, come back. No, yeah. So to come back to this whole displacement, I told you yesterday that, like, by the age of 14, I had traveled and lived all over the world, and that my first identity crisis was that moment of the Gulf War when I had to face myself as an Egyptian, and what does Egyptian mean? So I moved into a new zone, which was the filmmaker, because I didn't want journalism anymore, because I realized during the Gulf War is that journalism being a first draft of history, what I was actually doing was I had 2-3 hours to figure out what it is, and I was falsifying history myself. So I stepped out of the journalism domain. Sorry, journalists, but you know, it is about time and depth. So I decided to start working in documentary, African documentary. I wanted to do political history. I wanted to figure out what all this was about. So came the whole application So I don't know if Fola's around, but to come to Fola's point yesterday, once you start working in that domain, you get your application, and the application asks you if you're Muslim or Christian. It asks you if you're Sub-Saharan African or North African or East African or West African or diaspora. Never figured out exactly why diaspora was different. So all these categorizations, I sort of would sit in front of the application saying, okay, which one am I? And I never felt that I quite fit in any one fully. So I started my obsession with the word, and when I say obsession, it really has been 6 years, obsession with the word Sub-Saharan Africa, which Joseph used the minute he started that cover and apologized. So Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I can complain about the word. I can complain about the word sub. Why is it sub? Sub to what? But that I got over pretty quickly. What I really wanted to understand was what are the contours and how it was decided and when it was decided, because having read quite a bit of literature, I couldn't really find that word in colonial literature. So I go back to all the colonial documents, but they didn't, you know. So in 1884, when the scramble for Africa happened, it was divided into countries by colonial empire. So the contours of the regions were divided based on the empire, quote unquote, you belong to. So the actual regions looked very different. So how and when did this shift to the lines that don't actually respect the former colonial lines? How did that happen? So after a lot of looking, I found this one document, which is it was a classified, what's it called? Yes, a declassified document from under the Freedom of Information Act, and it was a document of a meeting in 1956 after the resignation of Anthony Eden. I talked yesterday about the 1956 Suez Crisis and how it opened the door to all these questions. Now, at that same time when that was happening, the Americans got up and said, uh-oh, if empire collapses, 50 countries at least are gonna emerge. These 50 countries are all gonna become members of the United Nations. And I looked around, like, guys, does anyone know what these countries are? No, nobody. America does not have a colonial history, so nobody really knew even where Malawi was and what Banda was supposed to be doing with it or whatever. So they had this meeting, and there were 5 main institutions sitting around the table. There was the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the CIA, and one other institution. I always forget that one, I don't know why. But anyway, so it was like the big institutions that were very interested in, it's not aid yet, but anyway, in figuring out the New World Order, okay? And so basically, the question was, how is America going to organize its foreign policy, and what alliances can it make in order to have an important and definitive presence, first in the UN, because the UN at the time was really important, and how is it going to manage all of this? And so basically they come up with this plan to start something called area studies. They invested $350 million annually. It's in 1956. So no, by 1966 it was up and running. And basically area studies was they started a department of area studies in practically most American universities. And to do area studies, they needed to recut the map. Okay, so I call it the re-scramble of Africa, or one re or two re's, scramble of Africa, because they lay down the map, and that happened to Latin America also and Asia, but I'm gonna stick to Africa. They lay out the map and cut the contours of the new sections based on American foreign policy interests, okay? So the word Middle East comes from 1960s. On the colonial terminology, there was the Far East and there was the Near East. The Middle East is a creation of the Cold War. They regrouped Egypt, Turkey with Iran. 3 countries that don't share a language, that don't share a have commonalities, but they are not a harmonious bloc. But that region was important to be under one department for its strategic and oil interests. That was the region where the new strategic resource was coming from, and the important political strategic area. Then there was North Africa. So they skip Libya, because at the time nobody knew that Libya would become, so North Africa becomes Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. So Libya and Mauritania are not included in North Africa. Then the Sahara is empty. It's nobody's. It's called the Sahara. And then sub-Saharan Africa includes all the countries that America has only one interest in, which is keep the communists out. And keeping the communists out becomes sub-Saharan Africa, which is the explanation to why Mauritania is sub-Saharan Africa, yet the oil and strategic interest makes Sudan Middle East. So that recutting of the map, we never think of it. It's not a natural, and it's not an old, and it's not a colonial division. It's a current division that, and the reason I talk about that is what fascinates me is that then we adopt that identity. So I sort of go around sometimes calling myself Middle Easterner. What on earth does that mean? And several times people refer to themselves being sub-Saharan Africa. What does that mean? And I guess that is what I'm trying to jolt you all into questioning tomorrow, okay? So I think one of the things I wanted to show about this redrawing of our identities based on maps, if I know how to open this. Let me do this one here. Yes. So that's one map from the 19th century. And I love the way the continent was described. First, there's Barbary, okay? So that whole top region was not North Africa, it was Barbary. And the Sahara went all the way down. For some reason, the Kingdom of Guinea was, there. So was Egypt and Nubia that goes all the way down beyond Ethiopia. And the rest is unexplored. So I thought that was a very interesting map. And if you actually look at the literature and the history written in the 1800s, like early 1800s, this exact mental mental scheme is what comes out in what is being transmitted as history at the time, okay? My next So I love this map because the Great Sahara is like half of the top, and Ethiopia goes like way beyond. It's like, I think the Congolese are going to be very happy to recognize themselves as Ethiopians. And then, I mean, it's just look at this map. So the people living at that time, what would they call themselves? How do you, I mean, like, these maps and these distinctions, these lines, these scrambles are part of what muddles up our own identity. And I guess because we adhere to them, I mean, I can't, like, why and how do we adhere to them? The Sudan, okay? Mali, the whole Mali Empire was called French Sudan. Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be a lot of work in terms of understanding how we got to these maps and how these maps actually affected the writing of the history that is being sent down to us. Which brings me back to I'll leave you with this map for a while. I want to come back to area studies that I described, how 350 million annually were poured into these area studies. Now, what area studies was just a department in different universities. Now, this department had a mandate to earmark and pick the best minds in the regions that have been allocated and to give them scholarships. So I mean, I'll show you later, people from the Carnegie Foundation would go into countries and go to the schools and pick the best brains and take them. That's the case of Aikwe Arma, whose book I will show you later. And so the disciplines not only created the map, but the content of the study, the anthropology included in how you study this very country became little by little the curriculum that we start studying, okay? So as I was going through this 700-page document, you know, about area studies that was financed, by the way, the 350 million had gone up to about 500-600 million, all the way to 1997. 1997, they ended the program of area studies and started a new department called multiculturalism, okay? Now, the interesting thing is, like, who is financing multiculturalism? Nike? I'm not kidding. Gates Foundation? So, in a way, it's a translation of the times. But I want to go back to area studies because as I'm reading this document, thinking, oh, wow, that's like quite an interesting way of proceeding to understand and dissect entire countries by co-opting. Of course, the people who are co-opted don't know they're being co-opted. They're being handpicked, given scholarships, and they're encouraged to do certain PhDs. So none of these people are sort of like sellouts or whatever. It's just the system was created. And as I'm reading the names of the people and the professors that were hired by the CIA to choose the people, I'm reading the names of the books that I studied. You know, little by little, I'm thinking, oh my God. And I am a pure product of area studies, like probably every one of you sitting here. Because as an educated elite on the continent, the books we have, the books we read, the references we have, all of them are an outcome. Even like, I mean, one of my favorite things is the, what's it called? The Heinemann African Writers Series. 100 African writers handpicked for this amazing series. So like Tayyip Saleh, Seasons of Migration to the North. He had a bursary to write that book even Aikwe Arma, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. All these series were financed by area study money. And there was, at the same time, the creation of something called the CCF, the Council of Cultural Freedoms, which had a pot of money for African magazine and book publishing only. You know about that, I'm pretty sure, the CCF. So you have Ugandan magazines like Transitions. Anybody know Transition? Which is one of the most important literary and, you know, struggle, what we thought was struggle, was 100% financed by the CIA. I'm not kidding. And now this is out and it's like, it's established. It's not like I'm saying that. And a lot of this stuff, so when you start digging, it's completely baffling. What does it mean? Where do we start dissociating our own knowledge from? So I want to show you my curriculum. So I go back to my books and I find practically every book. This one is called The Dwellers on the Nile. So I'm being told about pharaonic Egyptian history by Mr. William, like, you know, and now this is a survey of Arab history. I can't see the names by, you know, sorry, wrong way around, but yeah, okay. The politics of the Middle East, okay. Political order in changing societies, Samuel Huntington, okay. Every single book, the Arab press, okay. And this is South Africa, because I studied Chinese and South African politics at university. Every single one of my books was written by an American. Black Power in South Africa, she's a fantastic professor. But, you know, this is my education right there. I actually went and got every single book I ever studied and laid it out to recognize the extent of my colonized mind. And is it a conspiracy theory? It's not a conspiracy theory. There's nothing else out there. If you want to be educated, if you want to reach the status of a PhD, you need references. You cannot have a PhD without having footnotes and bibliographies. So, okay, I'm gonna do what, there we go. Actually works. And so that's where I go from external displacement to internal displacement. Okay, so you can roam the world and go from country to country. It's fine, because you know who you are. But when you suddenly recognize that the content of your knowledge, that everything, the premises of departure, where you start off from, is something that was actually devised specifically so you could think like that. So, which is what brings me back to the North-South divide. You know, this morning, the young lady here came up to me, and I thought it was really interesting, where she says, I know why there's the divide, because the Arabs were trading in slaves. I said, yeah, of course, the Arabs were trading in slaves. But how did they get these slaves? You guys had to go inland, fetch them, kidnap them, or whatever, and then sell them to the Arabs to ship them. So we're all in the same boat. There are no innocent people in the story and the history of the drama of slavery, of colonialism, because colonialism would have never held if there wasn't a comprador class, if there wasn't an elite that wanted to become an elite, that was used as an elite. And I look at the Rwanda experience, that division of the Tutsis and the Hutus, Tutsis and Hutus is not even an ethnic group. The Hutus were what do you call them? Pastor, that word. One of the words I can't pronounce. And then if you acquired enough money, your social status meant that you could buy enough cattle and buy land that promoted you to become a Tutsi. So there was social mobility. It was social classes. And suddenly the Belgians come in and say, okay, stop all this bullshit. Stop here. The tall ones with the thin noses are going to be Tutsis, and they're going to be the upper class forever. And all you others are not going to be. So at the beginning of social strife and the divide, even in specific countries, is about a very clear policy of making that divide a reality that then we integrate as our reality. So now Rwandans of today actually call themselves ethnic groups, which they never were. And so I can go on forever, but the point is, I think that the systems of knowledge and what we study, how we study it, how we exchange it, and how we transmit it. So, for example, the Mandinka people have a heritage of the griot of West Africa have transmitted the story of their people since the 13th century. So people like, does anybody know Sidiki Diabaté? Yeah. So Sidiki Diabaté is the 72nd griot with an uninterrupted lineage to the very first founder of the Mandinka Empire. So they transmit their knowledge from father to son, father to son. I have this beautiful clip where Siddiqui is with his son teaching him the Korah and telling him the story as his son is only 3 years old. So this transmission, this personal transmission of a kind of knowledge that isn't just done by a microscope and to be anthropologized, is very important. But how do we include it as part of our references? How do we include it as acceptable for a PhD? How is it footnoted? We don't fight for that. I mean, last time I fought for it, I got an F, but I did. So yeah. So I think for me, the question, and what I like yesterday's session and today's session. Okay, no, I'm done. I like finishing 10 minutes early. The two sessions, what I just wanted to sort of fuel in all of you is, let's question everything. Let's question what black and white means. Let's question what North and South means. Let's question what Sub-Saharan means. Let's put these questions on the table as the beginning of a process where, the road to Rome starts with a single step. Let's figure something out, why and how we can move together to an understanding of what we have as a commonality and why it's worth looking into. Thank you. Bye. The two talks I gave were an attempt to sort of bring us all to the space of reflection of this division between North and South of the continent and what led to it, what was the vision that first it embodied, how it broke down, or if it broke down, what the questions around it are, who the people, the events, the times. So any idea, any name, anything that feels relevant, any question, any contestation, any, you know, let's go kick the anthill, quoi, you know? So the way, I just have this as an example, which is completely not very relevant, but the way it looks, you know, it's just about, this is an example of how I think it's just a basic idea of write a square with either your question, the name of the person, finding connections, or if there are no connections, all of this. And here is Mushanja, Stacy, and Patrick. We're all gonna do this together, and we're gonna call on table by table to come help, reflect, contest, and from the floor you can tell us no, and you can throw things at us, okay? Does that make any sense? And if the whole thing breaks down, that can happen too, and that's fine too. Okay, so, okay. So I'm short and Mushanja isn't so well. So basically, I'm gonna go in the middle here and start with the idea of Pan-Africanism, okay? And the words that immediately come to mind are people, like, let's say, W.E.B. Du Bois. No, but you see, that's the thing. That's the thing. What I'm trying to get us to break are the parameters of our, this is how we think. Nehru could, I mean, like, if you see my film about Nasser, I'm not exactly the biggest supporter, but his influences and what he did, and at a time, was part of a collective vision. So let's step out of our comfort zones and our certitudes to question. You know, you could also answer why Nehru and Nasser became so close. When I say mapping, it's literally about let's put things on the table. We're not even discussing them. There's no right and there's no wrong. These are words, these are ideas that come to us when we sit and reflect about the state of affairs on the continent today, even from abroad, because from abroad, like from India, there's interaction the whole time. So you can't say that India is completely separate from that vision, because it is a collective history of post-colonialism in one form or the other. Okay, come. Let them be the first.
No, I'm just thinking about the formation of SADC and how that affects in South Africa, but also I think in the whole of SADC, that non-SADC countries have to pay same kind of fees as European and other international students at our universities in South Africa. So I don't know if that counts as a way to kind of maintain that division.
Yes, but like, for example, to add on to this, the whole bursary system on the continent that was created in the 50s, like, for example, again, I'm sorry, my main reference is Egypt, obviously. Anyone from the continent could come and study at Al-Azhar University, not necessarily just the religious side, but the technical side, for free. All you needed to be was a national from the African continent, including, I think, Indonesia and Malaysia were somehow included in that. And that started in the 60s.
I would also say if we're going to start talking about SADC, let's also go back and start talking about the AOU, which is where this idea of how do we have formations of states which are regional. So here we were talking about the OAU,
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah,
it's okay.
It's
okay. It's changed into the AU.
Which becomes the AU. And then we start having this idea of this breaking off into regions, and we end up with a SADC.
Yes.
So we start off with an idea or a vision of a AU, an African Union.
Yeah.
Well, initially the Organization of African Unity, and then we start getting to SADC, the West African Union, what's our East Africa.
There's
so
COMESA,
it's regional. So that's also for me an interesting point that we move from this to this continual breaking down and division.
So maybe it's also useful to.
Does that also, could you put the point university, for example?
Sorry?
Could you put down a point, just so I can understand how you're doing it, but can a point be universities, for example?
Anything can be the point.
The
Universities, the names of people, intellectuals, just anything that makes you think, oh, this is part of my idea of what African unity is about, or this is what is the opposite of African unity. Does that make any sense? Maybe it doesn't. Come.
So I'm just adding here fallism.
Yeah.
And how it's also sort of redefined Pan-Africanism today.
Yeah.
Because often Pan-Africanism hasn't always included, for example, queer people.
Yes.
And Rhodes must fall, Vies must fall.
Yeah.
Gandhi must fall.
And here you can also put negritude.
Have sort of, made us to think about
and if
feminism.
We start talking about that, we probably have to go back to the student movements in the 60s.
Yes.
And if we start talking about the student movements in the 60s, if we look at, there's this whole discourse that the whole of the 60s revolution that happened very much in universities in America, and how much of that was inspired by actually came from the Congo.
Absolutely.
So there's this huge history of how have universities collaborated that spread ideas of freedom.
Actually, I would put just up here the assassination of Patrice Lumumba as a key moment of people having to decide where they stand from this.
And for me, there's also a wonderful thing if we're talking about these ideas of universities, and that if we look at what happened in terms of historically, where we had in the 60s massive university uprisings in the Congo, across Africa, that then spread to America, spread to Europe, and became what is known as the 60s movement.
Yeah, we talk about 1968 from the French perspective, but 1958 in France was in May. There was 1968.
Can I bother you guys? I would be opposed to drawing in these 1960s movements to the fullest. I would want to keep them extremely separated, because what tends to happen is the historical trajectory of these, I don't know what to call them, the movements you're talking about get superimposed onto the fullest movement, which actually technically rejects some of those lineages. So there's a speed in South African universities to refuse to listen to the impulse of the fullest by superimposing it with
the bigger student movement.
Universities and liberal.
But they sit in the same space.
I think one has to. I agree with you there. I don't think that they're the same thing, and I think that the idea of wanting to separate oneself from history is important. However, I think there are important lessons to learn, because I think if one goes back into those early movements, a lot of it was started as very singularly radical thinking.
No, this is the question of time registers. It's always that thing of there is a dominant history that is easily referenceable, which people are always much more inclined to reference the easily referenceable histories, to the detriment of some of the really important histories that the fallism movement.
But I guess I guess one of the interesting things about a space like this is the what's the word? The both happening at the same time. The synchronicity. No, not synchronicity. The simultaneity of things. Quite a few things are happening at the same time. So if we put Pan-Africanism and negritude, they're actually happening at the same time. Parts of them are rejecting each other, and parts of them are feeding on each other.
I don't have a problem with those.
No, I'm saying fallism and the student movements, the more politicized student movements are sitting in the same space. They're
I'm just flagging a technicality. It's an effect.
Yeah.
It's not malicious. It's an effect.
Okay.
So what you put on the table, what I see as its effect, is an effect that will speed up the conversation to what a lot of people are versed in.
Okay.
at the
You're
expense
right.
of
Yeah.
what
Wait, I
people are not
disagree.
versed
I think a lot of people are versed in the 60s movement in France. How many people in this room are versed in the 60s movement that happened in the Congo? That actually was what started France. So what my question is not trying to bring dominant histories, but actually trying to bring the non-dominant histories. I'm saying that what we see as the 60s movement that everybody references Paris, the pavement is the whatever, right? That's the predominant kind of messages of the dominant history. What I'm saying is that those conversations started on the Congo. The French intellectuals were traveling to the Congo, speaking to Congolese students who then got written out of history.
And just to add, because the Congolese was happening practically at the same time in February 1968, there were two student movements in 68 and in 72 in Egypt. Practically everyone who started that student movement in 68 ended up in prison, and they came back in 2011, what we call the Arab Spring. Practically every one of them was in prison during the student movement in 1968.
Aren't you mostly running this stuff up while you're talking it?
I don't know how to do this. I'm
I just
68.
I just want to add this. The necessity
to react,
take a deal
yeah.
of that.
Because I think the assassination of Lumumba is a really critical moment in terms of the diaspora, in terms of how Pan-Africanism and negritude reacted to each other. It was this moment of recognition that maybe we got independence, but we really didn't. So what are we going to do about it? And just to add to what Patrick was saying about assassination of Lumumba, I think right after that, Lumumba, can you somebody write up there, creation of the CNL? The CNL was the nationalist movement that were the Lumumbists who continued to fight against the Belgians who had come to reoccupy the Congo 4 days after independence. 4 days. And they basically occupied most of the Congo until the mercenaries were hired and kept them sort of contained. What they did is that they sent the central bank, which was the money that they had, the central bank of the Congo was sent to Egypt. And apparently, the gold should still be there because it never went back. So anybody wanting to look for some gold. And so these connections, and just to go back to 68, 68 was also partly as a reaction to a vision that we were sold at independence, okay? So be it in the Congo, be it in Egypt. I sort of tend to speak from an Egyptian perspective because that's what I know best. So anybody want to come and ask, put questions, names of people? Come on. Yeah.
When you were speaking the other day, you were speaking about we should include Arabs in our definition of Africans because of the, there's very many different ethnicities. Why can't we accept Arabs? And I was thinking about the violent ways that Arabs participated in, slavery you know, for example, whites in South Africa, how they benefited from apartheid, and how now they can call themselves African, but it's problematic. It's, you know, because during that time, they were not Africans, they were Europeans. And now
So which time are you talking about? Slavery started in 1556. So do you want us, are you talking 1500s? Are you talking 1800s? By 1860s, technically slavery was supposed to be abolished. It continued for a while. But I guess what I'm trying to do here is going even beyond the 1900s to the moment of independence. So the moment of independence, which is a moment where I believe, maybe I'm wrong, that's what you guys should contest if you think otherwise. At the moment of independence, there was a common vision of a voice, a unified voice that would make a difference. We just, if only in the UN, blocks. And that's why when we're talking about India, I think we should write the non-aligned movement.
Yeah, I've got the Afro-Asian movement.
Afro-Asian.
Yeah. That came up earlier.
I think the central issue I have is these are grand narratives, kind of devoid of people somewhere.
But that's why we should put people.
Get people going.
Do we need clarity on why you're doing this? Because I remember when you spoke about your overall curatorial direction, you were speaking, this is a point for you that you're arriving at.
Yes, the reason I would like to get is to put on the table all the questions, exactly like what she's saying, where the divisions come from. The minute you say Arab, someone will say, oh, but you were the slave traders. Let's put this on the table and look at it. If the Arabs were the slave traders, of course they participated, but who did not participate? And I was telling the young lady, the Arabs had the ships, the doughs at the time, to transport the slaves, but to get the people from inland to the coast, who was doing it? Wasn't the Arabs. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that nobody is to be absolved from our histories. We've all been colonized. But doesn't anybody want to come share? And the point was we all should scribble. Why is it only us scribbling now? Yeah. Yes. Well, you're shy. What do you mean you're shy?
So, Dineo asked the question, what's African? Where does the word African come from?
As far as I'm concerned, at the moment, Africa is a continent. Africa is a geographic space that has its natural delimitations. Now, in that space, there is histories with an S. So let's say, can we also add the creation of the Arab Union? Because the creation of the Arab Union, it's about language, okay? So Chad, Djibouti, Somalia, Mauritania, all these are countries that are Arab countries, but I'm pretty sure you don't think of Somalia as an Arab country, because these groupings come out of a history. So the creation of the Arab Union was the creation of a space where language was the unifier, but language among those on the same continent. So for me, and please contest me, Africa is a continent that has now 55 countries. Each one of these countries within itself has multiple histories. So if we...
I think he wants to say something.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please.
I think we also need to talk about the Arabs' anti-blackness.
Yes.
Absolutely.
People of color that are African, their anti-blackness.
Okay, can I just respond to this 1 second? Racism, without a doubt. Again, I'll take my country as an example. 10% of our population is amongst the blackest of the black. The Nubians with the Dinka in Sudan are amongst the blackest races, okay? But they are Egyptian. Is there internal racism? Of course there is. Where the issue of racism comes from is part of the education system and part of the hierarchy that is precisely what I'm trying to kick. But this idea will not make a Nubian say he's not Egyptian. He can say a Nubian is Egyptian and he's gonna be black. So you're gonna tell him, are you racist? It's that playing with the concept of nation state, country. You see what I'm saying? Voila. Patrick, sorry. Not Patrick, Mancha.
Yesterday, Jihan made a comment about nobody being innocent if we have to talk about enslavement on the continent. I respectfully disagree, because when we say that, then we raise the resistance movements all over the continent.
True.
I'm going to use my country as an example. I'll use my clan as an example. The person whose name I have, Manche, he led several resistance movements against the British. Several. And there's a shrine in Accra with skulls and guns and cannonballs of the British. King Badubunsu, he was the king of their hunters. 5 hours outside of Accra. They fought the Dutch so hard. You should Google it. The Dutch sent a whole ship to a hunter to capture him. He had his warriors behead Dutch soldiers and they put their heads on stakes so when they're on the ship, you can see it in the water. Badumos was betrayed. They hung him and they chopped off his head and sent it back to Netherlands. Somebody found the head 5 years ago in a lab.
I heard about that, yeah.
It created some problems for the Dutch because they had to hand the head over. And several things. What I'm saying is,
resistance movements, yes.
We cannot say these things. They are very problematic when we say that nobody is innocent, because there were innocent people. There were people who fought.
Okay.
There were people who resisted with their very lives. So.
Okay, then we put Samori Tore.
And then also, we need to be aware of these things, and we cannot have this conversation. We cannot move forward if we do not deal with these things.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
No, I think you're completely right. And I think that resistance movements are not just the independence movements that are brandished, because even the ones we know as independence movements today are the mythologies of revolution. Because we know one independence movement, but there were 10 working at the same time that we ignore. So absolutely, we should also put people like, Samori Toure, what's his name? Omar al-Mukhtar, Ogakwe, like all these people. Brenda Fassi, I agree with you. But you see, I think opening a space like that is about discovering. Now we know his name. Now we have to go look for him. And I think each one of you here who think there is a point, a person, a song that we should all know and share. No?
I put a song.
You put what?
Africa Mokili Mobimba.
Yes. Okay, nobody wants to come up?
There's been a few people who have come up and put stuff on.
Yeah. There you go.
I'm just going to add here John Mwafangeo next to Brenda Fassi in thinking of queer archives and how we are never anywhere to be seen in this histories and how these histories are often heteronormative, and they're always told from a heteronormative lens. And I think these examples in history are giving us that
alternative
time to think about queerness and where's queerness in all of this? And where has it been? And why is it still not visible?
It's a good question.
Sorry, someone mentioned Mangaliso Sobukwe, and you said, and what was the organization?
PAC.
PAC.
Do you want to put Robert between brackets? No. Sorry,
I have a curiosity around the production of lip balm on the
Oh, fantastic. Tell us about it.
Essentially, and I can't remember the facts because it's one of these stories that you hear like in passing or whatever. My uncle is the one who told me. And he said that, and I'm going to get all the facts wrong, so if anybody knows, please correct me. In the early 1900s, land was being divided in Uganda in the early 1900s. And there were some people who were opposed to the way the land was being divided. They were Baganda people. So they started a movement. I can't remember the name of this movement at all, and it's killing me. And essentially, as a part of the movement, they also wanted to be able to create real economic opportunities for themselves. So they started producing material objects. A lot of them have kind of fizzled out since then, but until today, their lip balm is very popular still and used in Kampala. So for me, I didn't know, and you see this tin a bunch of times, whatever, maybe you use it, maybe you don't. But this lip balm is literally the product of a resistance movement that's so poorly known, at least by myself, that I can't even remember the name. And I feel like South Africa also has a similar connection with lip balm in some way or another. So lip balm seems to be really important for the freedom of all of us.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
And we also need to think about, we haven't said much about Miriam Makeba, but how she moved, how her musical life was quite mobile on the continent and beyond the continent.
I would say Miriam Makeba is one of the symbols of this real belief, from the onstart that she is a carrier of a message and a possibility of being a vehicle of this African unity. So when she leaves South Africa, she goes first to the US, and from the US to Conakry, to Guinea-Conakry. And while she's in Guinea-Conakry, she does do a lot of the moving around north and south. And in 1969, she was one of the main features of the Algiers Pan-Af, which was the cultural festival that came after Festman in 1966.
And I mean, there's also really interesting trajectories that if one starts to follow Miriam's trajectory, and you're talking about fallism, and if we talk about somebody like Tetsi Mashinini, who's another one of these actually great Pan-African characters. Now, Tetsi Mashinini was the person who actually started the student movement initially in South Africa and was forced into exile thereafter. He was then sent by the ANC to Europe. His flight first took him to London. He decided in London, I'm not going to Europe. He got off the plane in London. He phoned a journalist friend and he said, I've got off the plane illegally, help me. The journalist friend went and collected him and made a plan for him to be in London temporarily. He then moved to the United States. From the United States, he went back to Nigeria at that point to negotiate, to move the government funding away from, the Nigerian government funding away from the ANC towards the student movement that he was representing. The same fight was happening with the PAC. At Festac in 1977, Mbeki is there, busy negotiating with the Nigerian government to try and get the money to the ANC. The Nigerian government historically supported the PAC. So when Mbeki's there, Tetsi's also there trying to get the money to be moved to the student movement. Tetsi Mashinini is there, Miriam arrives, And she brings with her, one of her backing singers is somebody called Welma, who's the beauty queen in Liberia.
Yes.
She brings her as a beauty queen in Liberia. Tshetsi Mashinini goes to Miriam's performance, sees Welma, falls madly in love, and marries her, moves to Liberia with her. Yeah. They then have a massive fallout. He then is in trouble. He gets into a lot of trouble around her family who are very politically connected. The South African government again intervenes, and he ends up moving to Nigeria, to Jos, to university. Loses his mind there, doesn't understand what he's doing, goes, where is home, who am I, what am I doing? Ends up going back to Miriam in Guinea, and that's where he dies, mysteriously, and his body is shipped back to South Africa. So the way these personal stories, for me, we talk about these things in abstract, but once you start realizing these incredible
these are the same people.
These incredible connections that are happening. And we can't, of course, talk about fallism without talking about Tshetsi Mashinini and that history in South Africa, which is as relevant as any other.
So can I say something about Aikwe Arma, for example? Remember when I was telling you the other day about the beginning of the whole area studies program? Well, a guy from the Carnegie Foundation goes to Ghana and goes to his high school, and he's like the brightest kid in high school. He was about 15, 16 at the time, and they decide to give him a bursary and take him to one of the sort of very prestigious boys' schools, and then from there take him to the US, where he shared a room with, what's his name? The guy who wrote King Leopold's Ghost, Adam Hochschild. He was his roommate when he was 17, okay? And of course, being one of the people who have been earmarked to be part of that process, he is given an entry into Harvard immediately. He gets into Harvard, and in 1960, he hears about the assassination of Lumumba, and he's sitting there 1 year from finishing at Harvard, and he thinks, what is this about, this whole African independence thing? That's before he writes The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. Yeah, Nigeria's after that. Huh? And so basically he sits there and thinks they've just killed Lumumba, and that is the beginning of what was the vision of independence. And the Algerians had opened camps everywhere to train fighters. And so he skips class in Harvard and takes a plane, goes to Algeria.
Stopping by Cuba and Mexico.
Stopping by Cuba and Mexico. And yes, in Cuba, there's a whole story, but I'm going to skip that. And he arrives in Algeria saying, okay, here I am, because the Algerians had done an open call to say, anybody who wants to be a freedom fighter for the independence of all the Arab, all the African still under colonized countries, come join us. And so he arrives in one of the camps, and it was like, who are you? It's like literally arrives on his own, not as part of a group, or it's like, and they get really suspicious of him, and they take away his passport. And during that period, he goes and works in, what was it called, the Africa Documentation Center? So he opens up this kind of new archive, which is one of the first Afro-Arab archive on the continent. So it's just to add on to how and then more, okay, so then that phase ends, and he goes to wherever. I'll skip the details.
Well, first of all, he tries to go to Angola, and he can't go because he doesn't have his passport.
Yes.
So he gets barred from Angola. Then he ends up goes back to the USA.
Yeah.
And then Ghana again.
And in Ghana, he writes the book just before the coup d'etat of Nkrumah. And the point I wanted to get to is that many years later, in the 70s, he goes to this meeting, and he meets Sheikh Anta Diop. And Sheikh Anta Diop blows his mind away. And right now, as we speak, he is living in Senegal in a little village called Popenguine, and he has a publishing company that publishes, and most of the stuff he works on is the translation of hieroglyphics and ancient Egyptian narratives that, of course, he studied hieroglyphics, and he says, why are we telling the story starting now when within the continent the narrative already existed? Like this translation from hieroglyphics, some of the stories are mind-blowing.
You know, Attia's been holding the microphone.
Yeah, I was just about to say.
Oh, sorry.
It's really,
sorry.
It's really fun. It's all very interesting. So just learning about everything. So now we're a few points later, but I just wanted to say with Miriam Makeba also being spoken about, to also mention, because I've been studying this a little bit, Hugh Masekela's trajectory through the 70s in looking further into African roots from Guinea to Liberia to Hetzola Sounds in Ghana and Nigeria, and then also Zaire 74.
Yes.
Which I'm not sure if it's on the board. I just wanted to put that.
Don't you want to come put it in?
We don't know how to spell it. Sure, but wherever.
I'm very curious about military presence. Okay. So maybe it's perhaps hard to regroup every country represented here, and maybe everyone from each country could just try and think about at what point in time they started having their own military service, or you know what I mean? And prior to that, how it happened. Was there military presence in another country, foreign country, colonizers or not? For my part, from Mauritius, what I can say, like at that point in time, we don't have an army, which is interesting, but we have like a special intervention unit because of like 20 guys that are super trained. But on the other side, we have an American presence, small faction, just in case, okay? But the closest military base of the US is Diego Garcia, which is in the Chagos archipelago.
Yeah, Chagos,
which is a dispute
between
Mauritius and Britain, who's allied with the US, who actually are in the base. And we have as Coast Guards, also Coast Guard services, Indians, Indian Army, so we have a small faction in Mauritius also. And then we have a small faction of French, GIGA. So, my perspective,
shall I write military presence?
I guess that's important, but where it's relevant is what countries on African continent still have a close relationship with prior colonizers and their foreign, or neo-colonizers, and their foreign military presence at their own territory.
Personally, I think that's where the heart of the problem is.
I think the heart of the problem is the deterrent that it represents for the territory.
Tu viens le faire ou pas?
I mean, Djibouti is such an interesting example of that, where there are more people from the military than there are population in the country at the moment. It's great.
Real quick. So, right after Kwame Nkrumah became Prime Minister in 1956, this was a year before Ghana's independence. He established training camps throughout all the CPP. His government was called CPP. Everywhere in the country that had a CPP headquarters or party office, they also had a training camp for freedom fighters across the continent. Mugabe trained there, and right after he finished his training, he moved to Zimbabwe to start off the Chimaranga there. The ANC benefited a lot from those training camps. We were hiding MK fighters for a very long period of time, even into the 1980s. A lot of them, when the South African government was coming after them, they would come and hide in Ghana. You would give me a new identity, new passports, and a lot of them were put into the universities, and you have different names. To this day, there are MK fighters who still have homes in Ghana, who benefited off of Kwame Nkrumah's training camps.
And becomes very ironic in terms of like the xenophobia in South Africa.
Yeah, about that.
Yes, that's a good one.
I don't think that South Africans know about this. I don't think that South Africans are aware of how much money Ghana and Nigeria pumped into the ANC movement.
There was a fabulous Facebook campaign that somebody started, which is I Want in Nigeria, because so many people gave their pocket money. They used to in schools do collections for South Africa, give money towards the resistance in South Africa. So someone started I want my money back.
When I was in primary school, every year when it was Mandela's birthday, they would ask us to write letters to P.W. Botha to free him every year. And also, when I was young, when I was growing up, I told my South African friends, I thought this country was called Apartheid South Africa. I thought that was the name of the country. Because that's how they would say it in the news, Apartheid South Africa. You know, until I was much older, I thought that's what Apartheid South Africa is the name of the country. Yeah, and also there was a deliberate effort to categorize MK soldiers as freedom fighters and not terrorists. This was a policy throughout all the news networks. They will be referenced as freedom fighters and not as terrorists. Yeah.
In terms of if you look at the major festivals, a festival like Festac, they actually choose to invite the liberation movements as a country almost. So there's a whole block of people who are invited to the liberation.
I mean, we could also add the Havana. She needs to speak.
No,
yes.
I don't want to come up, but I just want to add Zambia being a protection heaven for
the ANC.
The ANC for a very long time. And just some days ago, actually 2 weeks ago, I visited the ANC house, or not the ANC house, but the Oro Tambo house where he hid for over 20 years. That Kenneth Kaunda protected so many people.
It was the headquarters.
Yeah, it was the headquarters and so many people. And one of my grandparents is actually South African, so I realized that growing up with a lot of like Zulu speaking and not really getting why they're always having these meetings and always these dinners and it's always South African women. So I just wanted to add the Kenneth Kaunda.
Kenneth Kaunda. I mean,
I don't know if he's already been mentioned, but I've been thinking about Frantz Fanon and the
goes right here.
He's here. He's here.
Okay.
But he needs to go way up there, no?
Very good. And kind of in relation to Pan-Africanism, but also of kind of thinking the kind of psychological underbelly of the colonial histories and occupation, because we haven't talked a lot about the kind of affective side of things, and I think the way he kind of connects the private and the political and the affective is really important in this conversation.
The private, and I didn't get that.
The private as in like what happens, I mean, the way he talks about violence that could happen like in a domestic space, but it's still linked to colonial wars or occupation or these connections of the private space and family and
yeah, but you see, I think what Julia just said is part of this. It's the private space where suddenly her grandfather is South African because the nation had harbored. And I think one of the things when we talk about xenophobia and why it should be here, I remember I was here in 2008 when the first big outbreaks happened, and I couldn't understand how come it was mainly the Mozambicans that had been killed, where in my mental history, Mozambique was one of the countries that suffered most to protect and help the South Africans. I mean, the Matola raid killed thousands of people and they didn't back down because of it. And that relationship of why is it and how is it and what triggers that kind of internal violence, I think we can take that xenophobia as an example and look on the whole continent. And in a way, it is what I'm trying to break the parameters of.
And the minute you start speaking about that, my mind jumps to the way that languages operate. So, and especially the colonial languages, and the division called colonial languages. And so within that kind of situation, you have like where we have in South Africa, and what is our relationship with Mozambique, and especially Angola? And how
I don't know how to write it.
I can get up.
Yes, I think you can.
Yeah, because there's also already
Oh shit! Okay.
where there's conflict between
Here.
French and English.
I think we must also talk about feminism and how conversations about Pan-Africanism often are dominated by patriarchy. I think this year we lost some of our most powerful, erased feminists on the continent. Thinking of Mama Winnie, thinking of military presence. Agustin Kwahepo was a freedom fighter at the front of SWAPO, in the camps, military. And the two sisters, Nora Shiming Chase and Ottilie Abrahams, who are both politicians. Ottilie Abrahams, who was a school principal, considered mother of education in Namibia, but has worked in Zambia, in Tanzania, Switzerland, Sweden, sorry, not Switzerland, South Africa, Namibia, suspended at some point by SWAPO because she used to be the chief of education in Tanzania. And her husband, who passed away last year, Kenneth Abrahams, got chucked out of SWAPO, but also caused some disruptions in Zambia to a point that Kenneth Kaunda had to say that Abrahams are Zambian.
Wow.
Yeah, so
Can
I
you
think
put next to it Fumalayo?
for Malayo. Okay.
We're talking.
How do I write it? Femalayo.
F-U-M.
F-U-M.
F-U-N-M. Oh, yeah, go ahead, yes. It's your beat. It's your beat, go on.
And it's at Amata Din, and
Yes.
connection with Jane Cortez.
Yes.
And the movement and the way it has been institutionalized as this delegate meeting and stuff.
Yeah, we put the OAU, the Pan-African Congresses. Okay, hold on. Can we write the Pan-African Congresses?
Can I bother again?
Yes.
Just on the subject of xenophobia, I think there's a very big problem with the use of that term because I don't think it really applies to South Africa. I'm not denying the violence that have happened, but I want to flag that there's this hegemonizing of migration, right? Number one, we assume that just as much as South Africans are ignorant of how much the rest of the continent helped the ANC and freed South Africa, we also assume that the people, so for me, and here I don't want to be controversial, I don't want to be denialist, but I will take the risk. For me, there's an expectation that the people that are migrating into South Africa and having conflicts with certain groups, or not even groups, with certain sections of South Africa that we all deem ignorant. What's happening there, that has nothing to do with what was happening with Africa. So as much as me and you know what was going on between ANC and the rest of the continent, people back home are not having those things. So for me, one of the narratives that gets underplayed in this debate of xenophobia is the constant cry by people that don't have as much space to speak about a form of colonialism that is happening. And I want to cite a very, when I was growing up, right? When I was growing up, we had a whole lot of shops that were run by local people. In one move, a community that is turned Pakistani, but it's actually not even Pakistani, moves in, opens one shop, completely drops the price to a point where the local people could not even compete, right? And then one by one, all those black shops close, okay? And then all of those shops are then taken over by these new migrants, okay? Now the price is double, okay? So for me, the question is, when that kind of narrative does not get space, because we are too quick to talk about the shared histories between Africa and South Africa, which are really true, but we forget that the realities of people that don't live in this privilege that we live in have to deal with. And when they deal with that, they don't care what they did, who did for Mandela. They don't see a Pakistani.
Absolutely.
They see a colonial force which is doing the same thing. Wait. They're seeing a colonial force that's doing exactly the same thing that the Afrikaans did when they got to the region. So for me to talk about, it's not an African problem that I'm talking about. It is a problem of a particular capitalism that is beyond race. So for me, I don't see Pakistanis, when the people in Alexandria are fighting, I don't see them fighting against Mozambican. They're fighting against a particular spirit of capitalism that is wreaking havoc. But because we are in our silos, we are too easy to label it a fight against Africans. It's not a fight against Africans. The point was just, we are too quick to assume that what we know is universal.
If you'll allow me, no, go ahead.
Afrophobia.
Yes, it's go ahead, you go.
Yeah, I guess to, I don't know, and I guess to approach it from a little bit more of a lived experience point of view, being somebody who lived here for quite a long period of time, and then slowly watching each one of our family members leaving here because of the way that people are being received here. I think what you're saying is true in terms of the capitalist forces that are happening. I don't think that has to be mutually exclusive with a fight of Africans against Africans, because then we suddenly start calling people these Mozambicans, and Mozambicans starts to take on a very bitter taste in the mouth. And then the word Mozambique, just starts to sound a little bit different. I think, again, from a very lived experience point of view, I find it very difficult to get down with all of your ideas that you just threw on the table right now. And I do think that, yes, what's happening right now, da-di-da-di-da, how does it really connect to the history, and how does the history really connect to the lived experience of this person? That's happening right now. But I do think that there's, maybe what that sentiment is trying to bring out when people do talk about the past is that, there was at one point a shared vision. How did it deteriorate so quickly? How can we find ourselves here where we then can't even identify that this is a capitalist force, but this is actually, as we call it, as like a Mozambican, this, that, the other, a Zimbabwean person. And again, the last thing, the people who are migrating here are also migrating here under duress. People don't want to move to a place where they're going to be beaten randomly, maybe da-di-da-di-da, and go and, this is not what's happening. So I think as somebody who moves between spaces, I'm very aware of, yes, what my presence in a space is when I'm an individual and when I'm a part of a community as well. I think that there's a lot of complex negotiations that have to happen when you go in and you share space. But I also think that actually still today, there are a lot of African countries that are making a lot of space for other African citizens. And I'm really happy to say that, it comes with very many complications, but Uganda welcomes so many migrants to the point where individuals are actually sharing their land with people and they're not being given incentives from the government. And I think that there's something in that mentality that is not only like really nice and happy and smiley, but intensely practical. That is also, just very useful for people.
Yeah, and to add, from my perspective, that fight also has to happen at the level of, that very often we overlook the real bigger enemies in looking at the smaller enemies. I'm not saying that seeing those kind of with those complex situations of capitalism, the situations you're speaking about, but I would be going asking questions also about things like Shopify, Pick and Pay, which are still often client-owned, white-owned businesses in this country today, and those are still holding enormous buying power, and where much of the power lies. And I would rather see those closed down and the small companies benefiting, the small-owned shops benefiting from having those spaces attacked. So it's just, there was a very interesting point that was raised about constitutions, and I don't know if you want to say something. Where's the mic?
Just before it goes, I think my intervention is not as much about right or wrong. Yeah. For me, the biggest problem is the interventionist tendency that certain classes of people in South Africa like to make. The fights against Shoprites are happening. The fights that's happening between the Mozambicans and the South Africans are happening, and people negotiate. But for me, there is a tendency in South Africa by a particular class that likes to be the middleman. Let those people fight it out. So that, you know, for me, I see what we call xenophobia as a culmination of a fight that's been mediated for more than 20 years.
Yeah.
If you go into the historical records, I study Kilobedu, and there is a particular class of music called Skaba. Even in the 1940s, they were already talking about the problem of migration. But there was always these liberal, and I say liberals sort of very loosely, that always want to intervene. No, you guys are getting worked up. Let me mediate. Let me make sure that each one gets. So for me, I'm not problematizing, I'm problematizing this interventionist thing that keeps coming, and this thing of why don't you go for ShopRite? Why are you fighting with other Africans when you could be fighting with Afrikaners? Stay out of it. Let the people do what the people need to do, because most of the time you complicate things because you want to teach us history, you want to teach us this and this and this. We all know that history. Some people don't know that history. For me, it's that thing, that insistence of wanting to give us a history that is irrelevant at a particular point. So for me, that is the thing. I don't deny xenophobia. I don't deny that it got out of hand. But I'm saying that why did it get out of hand? It got out of hand because somebody decided they're going to mediate between two equal people, the Mozambicans and the Balobedu, because Mozambique and Balobedu are very close to each other. They are equal. But here comes somebody who's going to come and say that, no, they are not equal. You are more equal. These are migrants under duress. Let the people do it peacefully without escalating and delaying it. So,
can I ask, the previous mic one that somebody came up last to speak? Can you come back to you? Yeah? There was an interesting point about constitution.
Well, quite quickly, but it relates a bit to what George is saying, because, for example, in Mauritius, when the constitution was written, like in, how do you say, a week ago, in closed sessions in London. So supposedly our forefathers who fought for independence had a closed meeting in London, and we wrote the motion constitution. But bits of our constitution, especially concerning law about land, is in French still, when we took our independence from the British, by the way. But when we left us with a constitution, they included a classification of a population on basis of races. So, but in weird ways. So you would address, as from now on, and it's in the constitution, as from 1965, and we got independence in 68. So you would address the population from now, at that point, as on basis of Muslims, Hindus, general population, and Chinese. And I think there's something about European descendants. So, which is pretty funky, because prior to that, even under colonized forces or regimes, just to know also that it's between 1815 and 1968 that Mauritius was under British rule, there never was that kind of classification. And the people related to each other as comrades in misery, because we were all there because of forced migration to start with, through slavery. But then afterwards, through indentured laborers coming through, and then Chinese, Arabs came through. So it's pretty intense also. So my point was about how each newly independent country at that point where we got independence were influenced in the writing of the constitutions, and in what languages are these constitutions still. So that's my point. I'm not sure how to...
The Magna Carta is still the basis of the Egyptian.
So many, I mean, there's a Haitian constitution that's really, we can go even back further into the age-old day with just like Madame, we can go back to that.
Yes.
So I think that in terms of constitutions,
Yeah. Toussaint Louverture. I have to put to son.
And of course, Jihan, you've done a film that's about how you were talking about how it was done behind closed doors in Britain, and you've done a film on South Africa and how that was also done behind closed doors.
It also had to think about mapping and la cartographie continent. So how we drew the line, design, contours of each territory. Because prior to that, each tribe or each community would be on the basis of how much land they can exploit.
Yeah.
You know, and you really have invisible boundaries, but they crossed on a malleable, basis. You know, so you can step into your neighbor's territory without it being an issue until it becomes like until there's real tension.
But I mean, look at Nigeria as the perfect example. Like the way the original settlers and the way the settlers, that's not the right word, but and the way the country is drawn is bound to have problems. I mean, and which is the case of most of the countries.
And how it also relates to what George was saying is how there are key interventions at crucial and critical moments for the development of different countries. Just after like that moment where we're supposedly breaking away from colonizers into this new scramble we are.
Yeah, who's playing behind the doors?
But I think the playing behind the doors for me is what neocolonialism is all about. The co-opting, and I always think that Rwanda is a very good example of this, because by 1959, the whole problematic of who is co-opted, who is educated, who has an interest in perpetuating this or that. So the game of the post-colonial realities that we live in today. What? Yeah. The dice were already sort of thrown. So this whole comprador class is very linked to education also. But if you'll allow me just to say one thing, more an example to reflect around. In the civil war in Lebanon that started in 1975 started by exactly what you said, the Palestinians moving en masse from Jordan to Lebanon, and because they're good commerçants, traders, little by little they were buying shops, exactly as you were saying. And what was happening is that the poorest of the poor, who happened to be in the south of Lebanon in the Shia areas, were being pushed a grade down. So they used to be, like with the immigrants arriving at the beginning, they were not the very bottom of the social scale. And when the refugees come, they're pushed even further down. And that was the trigger of the war in Lebanon. And what happened was 1975 until 1990, a civil war that started along economic lines, then was divided on religious lines, then became sectarian lines, then became family lines, because if we start that discussion, see, that's where I agree with you entirely that this happens. But you either enter that game and then only become divisive, or you resist that game and say, these guys are here. Oops. Yeah. You see what I'm saying? So the model, the example of Lebanon is actually quite flagrant, how a simple economic injustice even can end up being this. Yeah, go ahead.
I think a bit of issue with that because Lebanon is fundamentally a sectarian state.
True.
Even before the war. The way it was formed is a very balkanized country.
Completely.
And the way the country was sort of formed is along
very specific quotas for each sect.
Absolutely.
The Palestinian migrants only aggravated a pre-existing...
And triggered it.
Yes, a pre-existing injustice, which is that every sect is allocated a certain number of resources based on who they are. If they're Shia, if they're Sunnah, if they're Maronite, if they're Armenians, and so forth. I don't know about the context in South Africa. I can't claim to know that much. But my guess is it's also similar. The Mozambicans are not introducing, a new sort of political sort of mess up. Whatever pre-exists is exacerbated by these conditions. And this has to be addressed.
Voila. That's...
I would like more like solutions. How are we going to figure this shit out? But we're very decolonized minds. Our minds are still very decolonized. So how are we going to decolonize and talk about systems that we can create for ourselves?
Great. In 5 minutes, we move on from the scribble to the solutions. How about that? So.
Thank you. I want to speak right now because I saw that Jasper's already here, and then you can translate to me, because today I feel like my English is not on good mood. So, I will speak in Portuguese, then I will translate. Eu queria falar sobre o processo... Oh, God. Eu quero falar sobre o processo de libertação das colônias portuguesas, a forma como acontece e a forma como, mesmo estando dentro da independência, começam o processo de nacionalismos no mesmo período que há aquele boom de nacionalismo africano nos anos 60.
Okay.
So he wants to speak about the process of liberation of the Portuguese colonies and at that moment also simultaneously, and in that process, the emanation of sort of strong nationalisms.
Se a gente olha para a figura de Eduardo Mondlane, que foi o nacionalista mais conhecido de Moçambique, é verdade que o nome de Salvador Machado é que aparece mais, mas Eduardo Mondlane cria, une os movimentos para dar a frente de libertação de Moçambique, que é a FRELIMO. Nós vimos que ele entra no mesmo processo que entraram os outros nacionalistas africanos. Ele teve que receber uma bolsa da missão suíça para estudar, esteve na África do Sul, voltou, depois foi para os Estados Unidos da América e graças a esse apoio dos missionários ele voltou com outra visão de união, tal como aconteceu com Ezequiel Nenante, como aconteceu com o John Dube, como aconteceu com o Camus Banda. Mas o processo de libertação das colônias africanas portuguesas só acontece muito tarde, justamente por causa da situação política de Portugal. Então, há aqui uma influência externa para a independência das colônias portuguesas, tem a ver com a economia.
It's more of the Cold War was much more, like by 74 the Cold War had... Oh, sorry.
If you look at the figure of Eduardo Mondlane, who was the most eminent, even though now in retrospect less visible than Samora Machel, figure of the liberation movement. He went through a very similar process as many other people at the forefront of the liberation movement, which is that he had to get scholarship bursaries or managed to get to study abroad, and it was whilst abroad in Switzerland, in the United States and so on, that the common vision of these people meeting abroad was formed. And so when they came back, this ideology was then further established in the context of the Portuguese colonies. Because of the specificities of the Portuguese state, it was much later than elsewhere, but it was still very much under external influence that this happened.
And that's why if you just, the Cold War, I think, is something we did not add here, which is really important.
I understand the role of Cold War. I understand the pressure between URSS and the United States. But I understand the pressure of USA to Portugal to leave the colonies free. But it's very important to understand that Portugal still needed the African colonies as the blood. Salazar said something in 1930, like as colônias são o sangue da República.
Our colonies are the blood of our republic.
They still need it. So quando aconteceu o golpe em 1974, quando acontece o golpe de Estado em 1974 em Portugal, as colônias portuguesas já estavam na luta de libertação. O que eu quero ressalvar é que esse sentido de apoio. A Argélia ficou independente em 1962, mas já em 1963 o primeiro grupo de moçambicanos ia treinar na Argélia para lutar, liderado por Samora Machel. Moçambique ficou independente em 1975, desculpa, mas já em 76 enviava uma parte do seu grupo para ajudar Zimbábue na luta pela independência. E ao mesmo tempo éramos atacados pelo Ian Smith, éramos atacados pelo regime da apartheid por estarmos a proteger ANC. Então era mais para trazer esses coisas. E é uma coisa muito importante, nunca falamos dos artistas. É que há 2 artistas moçambicanos que foram presos pela PIDE, que é a Polícia Secreta Portuguesa, por causa de apoiar a luta pela independência, que é o artista, o plástico Malangatana, Valente Guanha, e o poeta José Craveirinha.
So it's about making the connections between the different countries. So when the coup d'état happened in Portugal in '74, the liberation movement was already happening since a very long time. So when Algeria became independent in '62. In '63, they started receiving people from Mozambique, from Frelimo to be trained to have that struggle and lead that war. At the same time, when after '74 Mozambique became independent, they started receiving people fighting for the independence in Zimbabwe. And at the same time, Mozambique was very much under attack by Smiths and by the powers of apartheid regime for protecting the ANC and the South African liberation movement. He also makes a point of at that time, two Mozambican artists being put in jail by the PIDE, which was the secret police of the Portuguese Salazar state, which was the visual artist Malangatana and the writer Craveirinha, José Craveirinha.
I mean, just to go back to what you're saying is also valid for Guinea-Bissau, and that's why I wrote Cabral next to, and I think one really interesting thing, Agostinho Neto, of course, but I mean Cabral I think was more of a marker because it's the PAICG that connected two countries and was the beginning of the breakdown of the Portuguese Empire. And one of the interesting things about Cabral is that he actually did two things that I thought were really interesting. He understood that as a country, a common history needs to be forged. So the battle, the fight of the PAISG was much more about forging a common history. And the other thing was using Portuguese as a common language, because in such a small country there was something like 100 different languages, and so they started by doing street theater as a way to connect and communicate what the fight is about, and the decision to use Portuguese as the common language, despite it being the colonial language, was a very interesting thing, and he defended it even in the conference in Havana. So I think the Portuguese, it's a shame there are no Angolans here, because everything we're saying depends on where you're coming from in Angola, and was a moment of complete change. But for example, to come back, and now if you don't mind, I'm going to wrap up. Like Angola, for example, the 3 or 4 liberation movements in Angola, every one of them had its headquarters in Cairo. The MPLA, the FNLA, UNITA, and there was another one, a smaller one, Roberto Holden's, okay? and there was always problems because it was obvious that the MPLA was much stronger and had much more Soviet backing, and Egypt at the time being quite heavily dependent on the Soviet Union because it's after the '67 war, they absolutely insisted on keeping all four liberation movements, because the point was, we want the independence first, then you guys sort it out. And that's why until today you actually find some little Angolan things all over Cairo, which is quite interesting. Same for South Africa, the PAC, the ANC, all of them had offices in Cairo. So these connections, so basically, I think we went quite a long way away in this.
I wanted to say that I saw someone wrote a luto continua for me up here recently, and I said that phrase, and an Angolan friend of mine came back with, yes, but we've forgotten the second half, which is, of course, that victory is certain, is what the full phrase was, and it's now just become a luto continua. We've dropped victory is certain, because it certainly isn't.
It's because the struggle never stops,
Yeah.
right?
Excuse me, I think for this question of language, I think also there was one organization that's appear now about the Portuguese language, which is PALOP. That is a way of unite through the colonial language, which is Portuguese. So I think it would be interesting to add as well as one of the important.
Well, where do you want me to add it? Next to here. Okay, Palop.
He's coming.
Okay, there you go. No, you do it.
Jihan, can we leave it up for the rest? I mean, will it stay up so people can keep scribbling?
Yes. Yes.
And also, please start to make links, because I have the feeling that there's enough lines.
There are no links. But you see, I think I don't mind that. I think I'm really happy about this, because I thought we wouldn't get more than 3-4 words up there. And I think what I was hoping to achieve is to realize that there are lots of commonalities, common names, common moments, common episodes that we either know about and don't actually know the context of or the content of. There's stuff up there that might intrigue some of you to look at further. And I think that, I put FISPACO in with Pan-Africanism because that was one of the moments where, in terms of the arts and culture, it came out of a real vision that the arts have a space in this unity and a common cultural heritage. And when FISPACO started, the forefathers of FISPACO did do it. It's a biannual festival, because one sits in the south and one sits in the north. But Tahir Shrea and Samben Osman were really sort of forged together this common vision precisely to avoid this disconnect between the north and the south. And so solutions. Who can come up with solutions? There, Mancha.
There are no solutions.
That's a solution. Let's bring back hope.
First, I would like to address my man George. You know I love you. For solutions, I think that problems have been created throughout the continent that have become cultural practices that we hold on to and say that it forms part of our identity. When South Africans say kwere kwere, what does it mean?
Related to the sound of here, but I can give you a history of other names within South Africa that was the same time.
Doesn't it mean Muzungu?
I thought it meant cockroach.
What's that?
But you say that, South Africans say that to non-South Africans.
Oh, quite.
A history in South Africa, Shangani and Norway are still considered under
I've been called Kwere before.
I'm also a Kwere.
Well,
because when I speak, people just hear, when I speak to Norway, people just hear, so it's but you're still correct.
But it does mean foreigner, though.
Yeah.
Yes, no?
Like,
oh, so it's become, when people say Kwere, it's not pleasant. One, it means you're unwanted, and two, if you don't move, they will attack you. I'm saying this also because a South African friend of mine that lives in Accra showed me a WhatsApp message from somebody in the ANC parliament. Now, they're still there, I don't want to mention their name, but virtually rallying up South Africans to kick other Africans out. This is somebody who's in government now. And the number of times Kwere is used in this, I'll find it and forward it to you. I think that if we're interested in, first of all, I think that Pan-Africanism needs to be updated. It's like an app that needs to be updated.
Absolutely.
And that's where the conversation is. But I think that we need to get to the root of the problem. There's a lot of problems that have been created that have become cultural practices.
There's some hands on that side.
So why do South Africans call non-South Africans Kwere? I'm not done.
I want her to also have mic.
It's the Ngunis. The Zulus, when they hear Kwere speaking, instead with the sound of the language. We are Kwere, so the Zulus, everyone knows that when you're speaking to a Zulu person, you must speak Zulu. Whether you're Shangan, you're Pedi, you're Venda, you're Xhosa. So when a person who doesn't speak Zulu speaks to a Zulu will say, we are Kwere, so we are Kwere in my ear. So that's where the word, that's how I understand it came, and I suppose it evolved, but it's from that whole Nguni resistance to understand other people's languages.
But it's complicated. It's complicated. It's not just South Africans and non-South Africans. It's complicated. There are languages in South Africa and ethnic groups that can be considered Kwere because they are not Nguni.
Just addressing solutions. So from my point of view, because the issue of slave trade and the Arabs was raised, and it's very true, I think one thing that needs to be started, and it already in a way started, not enough, but in Tunisia and Sudan, definitely there are movements of opening up this part of history. And I think from my point of view, that's a very big thing that if opened, can also then get us to relook at Pan-Africanism in a different way, because I think for me, the myth with the Nasser Pan-Africanism is the not viewing of the hierarchy that was in the thinking of the time and in the view of the laws that were put and politically. So
what do you mean the
wasn't
hierarchy?
This illusion of they're all nice and happy together and equal.
What do you mean the hierarchy? I didn't understand that.
I mean, in a way, after Nasser, when you look at it in Egypt and the negotiations that have to do with Pan-Africanism, I mean, it's a very subjective reading, but it always feels like we're either there and leading or we're not, which is, for me, also a way of reading the current Nile crisis.
True, but not, I mean, like, with the OAU, the Ethiopia leading was despite Nasser, and he went along with it. So yes, I see what you're saying in terms of there's certain countries, Egypt definitely being one of them, that in South Africa being the other, is we're leading NEPAD. You guys want to come along, great, but nobody else can lead. Same with the Egyptians on many fronts. But I think that there is that issue in terms of even Nigeria is another one. We have like 3 or 4 spaces that are like almost continents, that they're self-sufficient, they have all it takes, and they see themselves as the leaders of the continent in different ways and in different manners. But I think that this whole thing about opening up the question of slavery needs to be even more violent and address why we're not doing anything today about what's happening in Mauritania. I mean, or what just happened in Libya. So like, how can we be in 2018 and still turn a blind eye to slavery being a norm in a country that's right here?
Or the way that capitalism itself operates very often as slavery, and that's happening in this country.
Yeah, so I mean, the whole question, like in Lebanon, for example, the whole Ethiopian trade, you can call it migrant workers, but the truth is it is slavery of a different form. So I think what Mantia was saying about redefining what Pan-Africanism means was already due in 1974. Because when the six-pack happened, which is the sixth and last Pan-African Congress in Tanzania, it was very clear that the word Pan-African Congress, which was coming from America, from Black America to Africa, which was now adopted part and parcel by Africa, no longer meant the same thing, and that's why the seventh Congress never happened. So I think that is, you know, I think that the desire for some kind of a collective vision still remains, much less than before, but maybe we can work with that little bit.
How did we get here in the first place? You know, how did we get here to the point that now we have to think about ways of reconstructing how we identify ourselves, and also how to create better relationships or create a common vision on the continent. A device was created to create these divisions. What we need to create is another device to diffuse it. And that's what we need to think about thoroughly. How do we diffuse these cultural practices that we've taken on to recreate a new identity for the continent? I'm interested in that conversation because this didn't just arrive here. It was carefully thought out and very systematically implemented. You know, through missionaries, through trade, through economic relationships, through diplomacy.
Absolutely.
So, we need to create another system, another device that will diffuse this thing. And I think we need to attack it from people's cultures, around the continent.
NEPAD. Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things that was really interesting about NEPAD.
How do I write it?
NEPAD. It was an attempt, for whatever reason, huh?
I like the fact that NEPAD is just on top of
Yeah, sometimes the chance encounters are the most important ones.
Yeah, so it was an idea of African Renaissance that comes out of the beautiful speech of 1996 called "I Am an African," and it was this attempt to let's find a way, a new device. Where did he go? Mantia, a new device to address this whole idea of African Renaissance and working together based on commonalities rather than divisions. But then divisions happen fairly quickly within. And it's, I mean, maybe I'm a bit of a lefty if you want, but it all starts with the problem of big money. Big money wants to do it differently. So, voila. I don't know whether I think what I would like to do is keep this up, and for anybody who has anything to add, if you want to color it, if you want to connect it, if you want to scribble things out, if you want to put exclamation marks, if you want to. Yeah, and maybe taking a picture and looking at the points you didn't know and would like to discover, and maybe this could be the beginning of a process.
I think this is a monster of Pan-Africanism to try and tackle, just because there's just too many people with too many different agendas, and at the end of the day, the constructs that have been put in place have been reinforced by agenda. So it's a monster
Of a million heads.
Yes. But what I see here is sourcing, crowdsourcing, and a lot of the things here, very quietly humbled by the wealth of information that has come out from the different people here. And what will be really interesting will be for me, because if I take a screenshot of this, I don't know that I'll be able to connect it.
But it's not just about connecting. It's about seeing something that intrigues you. I mean, of course it's a monster of a million heads. Like, how are we going to deal with 55 countries and hundred years at least of... The point is that we are art practitioners, and we can pick out one thing and decide to collaborate or find out more or do something about it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So what I was trying to say was, for me, yeah, it's not, yeah. For me, what I'm getting out of this, I said, is there's a sourcing sort of thing happening here where everybody's sort of feeding into it. And also, there's a realization that we are more connected than we think we are. But this is a lot of sort of, like I said, if I take a screenshot of this, I wouldn't necessarily be able to put those things together. And just personally, as an inspiration for collaboration, if I can see the connections, maybe that could actually, if I could see the connections, maybe that can then lead to some form of inspiration. So what I was suggesting as a very practical thing is there a way in which we can, and just given how much information that I've heard you share the past 3 days, all of them, we can find a way of, giving what we know and then connecting it, and then seeing if something can be done from that information.
That's perfect.
Is there a place where it is already happening, where if you go to this place,
I think Chimurenga is already.
We've done a couple of mapping issues. I know we have a whole issue which is an attempt to remap. We're busy working on a new one which is an attempt to remap. So a lot of this stuff, I mean, certainly the stuff that I was bringing, I brought it, I cheated to some extent because there are almost 10 people who should be standing behind me, at least, maybe 100, who have contributed to the knowledge we've kind of been collecting as an organization, as a Pan-African, trying to work in the contemporary and to redefine Pan-Africanism. So we have an issue that's dedicated to mapping that came out. I know Chimurengas are quite available in Joburg at the moment. I think they're at Bridge Books. I think they're at, what's the African bookshop called just across from you? Yeah. So and the book fair is happening at the Market Theatre. There's a stall. We do have stuff here. So you can definitely get hold of otherwise go onto the website, chimurenga.co.za. You can order online.
See that selling pitch, yeah?
Chimurenga has been, and if people have stuff that they want to contribute to look at our issues and say, we want to bring in, we've done everything from trying to map jazz, and really it's been a question of, because for us, we're trying to say we're a Pan-African organization, we just practically work that way, and Jihan's one of our family, and many other people in this room are part of the Chimurenga family. So it's just a way to try and connect and create a network.
So mapping in bits and in different areas does exist. But the reason I wanted to do it like this is that I'm coming from the divide, and let's try and see where the divide is and how we can, instead of jumping the north of the continent and going to Europe, we can go through the north of the continent on our way to Europe. And I think there's a lot of this stuff that you can, using the Chimurenga maps, just taking bits and reading about it, the connections and if you guys are saying I have to go to the airport, but with you guys connecting the stuff already, so like we didn't write Kwame Nkrumah, I can't believe it. You did? Okay.
Yeah, there are many hidden things in there.
Yeah, there he is, yeah. Okay, so we can, like, things like that. I would do a link like this because, for example, the very first critique of the whole model of what is Pan-Africanism is it just replacing the old colonial structures with the exact same structure but with black faces, was a critique written in this amazing book. It's a tiny book called The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, but it was written in 1966, just before the ouster of Nkrumah. And if you read it today, you think he could have written it last week. And it's and that transformation that never happened, that independence that we never really got, because the foundations of the system that we rebuilt on was the colonial foundation. The education system was the colonial one. So someone here in South Africa told me a great example. They said something like about South Africa being like a cappuccino, with a sprinkle of chocolate on the top. And I think mentally, that's somehow the structures that we've been part of. That's what's happened. Our mental structure is like a cappuccino. It's black and white, but with a sprinkle of chocolate on the top. Yeah. So I think I can say thank you very much for participating in this chaos, because chaos is good. Yes. I like chaos because it's out of chaos that some things can start. So, and thank you very much, and goodbye. Thank you very much, them mainly.